Welcome to Warriors Bulletin News, your ultimate source for the latest Golden State Warriors news, trade updates, breaking stories, and in-depth analysis. I get to Shannon saying that's a yes with the absolute conviction of a man who has just heard a legal confession, is that the 20 minutes of debate preceding the call were actually very good. I want to acknowledge this because the drama of the call sometimes overshadows the quality of the argument that pushed Stephen A. to the decision to make the call, and the argument deserves its own recognition. He was making a genuinely strong, technically precise case for Jabari Smith Jr. to the Golden State Warriors, and Shannon was pushing back with a structural counter that had real merit, and the debate was the kind that makes you think rather than just react. And then Stephen A. crossed the threshold and did the thing that changed everything. He said, "You know what? Let's settle this right now. Get Mike Dunleavy Jr. on the phone, Liv. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly the biggest way to support this content. Every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. Nobody in the studio took this literally. This is the failure mode that I keep thinking about when I replay the morning. The moment where everyone in the room had the opportunity to stop what was about to happen and chose not to, or chose not to quickly enough, because none of them fully believed it was actually going to happen. Molly looked at Stephen A. with the evaluating expression. Shannon tilted his head slightly in the way he does when he is deciding whether something requires a response, and the production team dialed. Mike Dunleavy Jr., the general manager of the Golden State Warriors, answered his phone. He answered it the way you answer a call from a known number in the middle of an active workday, alert, prepared for a short professional exchange. The voice of a man who is busy, but has chosen to take the call because the relationship warrants it. He said hello with the professional warmth of someone who takes media calls regularly and has a functional working relationship with the person calling. He had no reason to be guarded. He was not on live television. He had not been told he was on live television. Let me give you the full 20 minutes first, because the content of the debate is essential to the significance of what the call confirmed. Stephen A. had been making a case that I want to describe as elegant in its basketball specificity, because elegance is the right word for an argument that is precise, rather than just emphatic. He said the Golden State Warriors and Jabari Smith Jr. represented one of the clearest organizational fits available in the current trade market, not in the general sense that Smith was a good player who could help many teams, but in the specific technical sense that Smith's skill set was built for exactly the kind of system Golden State ran, and exactly the kind of offensive environment that Steph Curry's presence created. He went into specific detail about what he called the Draymond Green comparison, which I thought was the most interesting analytical frame of the morning. He said that what had made Draymond invaluable to Golden State's championship teams was not any single skill, but the combination of defensive versatility, the ability to guard any position with high IQ decision-making, and the willingness to subordinate individual scoring to team function. He said Jabari Smith was not Draymond in the full sense of that comparison, but that Smith represented the evolution of that profile for the modern NBA, a player who brought the defensive versatility, the positional flexibility, the defensive IQ, and added the specific offensive quality that Draymond's game never developed, which was a reliable three-point shot. He said a player who combined Draymond's defensive footprint with a legitimate shooting threat was not just useful in the Warriors system, he was transformative in the Warriors system, because it meant every defensive adjustment the opponent made to stop the Warriors' shooting was now also giving up either a Curry shot or a Smith shot, and the math of that created offensive advantages that were genuinely unsolvable. Shannon had a good counter, and I want to be honest about it because the counter was genuinely strong. He said the Warriors were at a complicated organizational moment, that the core around Curry was aging, that the front office was trying to balance competing priorities between extending the championship window and building toward the next era, and that acquiring a player on a 5-year contract worth over $100 million locked them into a specific roster direction, rather than giving them the flexibility to adapt as the situation evolved. He said Jabari was 22, which was usually a reason to acquire someone, but in this context was also a reason to evaluate carefully because a 22-year-old on a 5-year deal was going to be a Warrior through 2 distinct phases of the franchise's development and needed to fit both. He said the discussions, if they existed, were probably more exploratory than the reporting implied, and that exploratory discussions and imminent deals were very different things. Stephen A. said he had sources who said the discussions were past exploratory. Shannon said his read of the situation was different. They went around this for 20 full minutes, and then Stephen A. lost patience with the gap between what he knew and what he could prove in the current conversation, and said the words that changed the trajectory of the morning. Dunleavy came on the line. Stephen A. asked directly about Jabari Smith Jr. and the Warriors. The pause before Dunleavy's response was 3.5 seconds. I counted it. 3.5 seconds as the pause of a man calculating a response rather than retrieving one. A man who has received a question that requires more thought than a routine media query because the question is specific, and the answer, whichever version of it he chooses, has implications. He said, Stephen A., you know I can't comment on discussions we may or may not be having about players on other rosters. And then, in the specific beat that followed that careful first sentence, he said, but what I can tell you is that we are always looking for the right pieces to help this team, and we are thorough in how we approach that. Shannon said, that's a yes. Dunleavy said, Shannon, and then the pause. The specific pause that is not a pause for thought, but a pause for damage control. The sentence he had started, almost certainly something like Shannon, I didn't say that, stopped before completion. And then, with the quiet resignation of a man who has understood the situation and its implications, hold on. Am I on air right now? Molly said, yes, Mike. I'm so sorry. This is completely on us. There was a brief silence, and then the line went dead, and the studio produced the specific kind of live television eruption that only happens when something that was not supposed to happen has just happened in the most perfect possible way. The phrase discussions we may or may not be having is the most interesting linguistic construction in Dunleavy's response and deserves careful attention. This formulation, may or may not be having, is not standard deflection language. Standard deflection language for a situation where no discussions exist is, I can't comment on other players' situations. There is no need to introduce the may or may not construction if the discussions simply do not exist, because may or may not implies that one of those options is true. It is a construction that acknowledges the possibility of ongoing discussions as a real possibility, rather than a hypothetical one, which is the specific way that front office executives speak when they need to avoid confirming something while also being technically accurate. Dunleavy could not say there are no discussions because the accurate word was may, and so he used may. Shannon heard the may, I heard the may, Stephen A. heard the may. The second sentence, we are always looking for the right pieces and we are thorough in how we approach that, and is the confirmation wrapped in its professional container. We are thorough in how we approach that means the approach is happening. You cannot be thorough in your approach to something that you are not approaching. Dunleavy was describing, with careful diplomatic language, the actual activity his front office was engaged in. The activity involved Jabari Smith. The language confirmed it without technically saying it. Shannon decoded the language in real time and announced the decoding immediately. And Dunleavy, who had been speaking at the level of candor appropriate for a private conversation with a trusted media figure, had used the accurate words and was now processing the consequences of having used them on live television. The football-basketball case for Jabari Smith to Golden State is one of the most compelling roster construction arguments in the current market, and I want to make it properly. Stephen A. His analytical frame of the Draymond evolution was correct, and it deserves to be followed through to its conclusion. The Warriors' championship model has always been built around a specific principle: create the conditions for Steph Curry to operate in space, and then ensure that every player around Curry converts the space his movement creates into productive possessions. The players who have done this best in the Warriors' history have combined two qualities: the ability to be a real offensive threat that defenses cannot ignore, and the defensive versatility to guard multiple positions without breaking the defensive structure. Jabari Smith has both qualities at an exceptional level. His three-point shooting, legitimate volume shooting in the high 30s%, means defenses cannot leave him to help on Curry. The specific way this matters in the Warriors system is that every Curry action generates attention, and the attention Curry generates creates the kick-out opportunities that Smith converts. If Smith could not shoot, defenses would sag off him to provide help on Curry. Because Smith can shoot, the defenses stretch to cover both simultaneously, which means neither Curry nor Smith is being fully defended. That is the geometric advantage of pairing a dominant shooter with another legitimate shooter, and it is the foundation of how Golden State's offenses have historically operated when they were at their best. The defensive dimension is where the Draymond comparison is most apt and most important. The Warriors' defensive structure requires a player at the 4 position who can switch screens without creating mismatches, guard guards and wings in space when switches occur, and provide interior protection in small ball lineups. Draymond does all of this from the defensive side with minimal offensive contribution. Smith does the defensive side with genuine offensive contribution added. That is strictly better in every dimension except the specific floor general communication role that Draymond plays, which is a real and significant role, but one that a player of Smith's intelligence and two-way profile can grow into. The age dynamic matters enormously here. The Warriors need to think about 2 overlapping timelines, the final chapter of the Curry era and the foundation of what comes after. Jabari Smith at 22 is a player who can contribute meaningfully right now in the current championship window and who will still be developing and growing as the roster changes around him. He does not need the team to rebuild around him. He is the specific kind of piece that fits the current team and also survives the transition to the next team because what he does is not dependent on any particular collection of teammates. He creates space. He guards multiple positions. He makes smart decisions. Those qualities are valuable on every version of every team. The Warriors are acquiring him for now and for later simultaneously. After the call ended and the studio had begun to organize the eruption into something resembling analysis, Stephen A. said, "Everything I was telling you for 20 minutes is confirmed." He said it without triumph, which was unusual for him in moments of vindication, and I think the absence of triumph was itself a form of seriousness, a recognition that what had just happened was significant enough to be treated with gravity rather than celebration. Shannon said he was not going to dispute the language. He said Dunleavy said what he said and the language meant what it meant. Molly said she was calling Mike Dunleavy Jr. the moment the show went to commercial. And the studio went to commercial with the specific energy of a morning that had produced something nobody would have predicted and that everyone who was there would remember.